Hello Year 7 and Happy New Year from the English department. This is the first lesson in the Timeline of Language and Literature unit that we'll be studying together up until the end of spring. This first lesson is all about Latin. On Google Classroom you'll be able to find this lesson along with this video, and there is a Google form for you to fill in with your answers. If you are unable to access Google Classroom, don't worry, you can write your answers on paper. I hope you enjoy it, and we look forward to reading your responses. So Latin is considered to be what's called a dead language, but about a quarter of the world's population still keep elements of Latin alive in their speech. These are languages that we might call Romance languages. Your first question is, what do you think dead language means? If you try and answer it without looking it up first, if you then need to look it up to check, that's absolutely fine. So what do you think it means when we say something is a dead language? Your second question is, where do you think the name Romance language comes from? Why might we use the word Romance to describe languages that come from Latin? Can you think of any languages that might be considered Romance languages? So where might those countries be that speak Romance languages? So this map might help you to answer some of the questions on the previous slide. Those of you who are good at geography, when it comes to answering the question about which countries still have Romance languages, all of these countries shaded in different colours are countries that have Romance languages as their chief language. Those of you who are good at history will recognise that this is also a map of the Roman Empire, or at least the western side of the Roman Empire. This might help you answer the question about where the term Romance languages comes from. So all of these countries were colonised by the Romans when they built their empire. This country on the right there, that is a gold colour, that I'll give you bonus points for naming that country. I'll give you bonus points if you can name that. And the reason it's out there on its own, away from the others, is because most of these countries shaded in white down towards the bottom right corner of the map and in the middle there, their predominant language was not Latin, it was Greek, or the language that they were speaking already. But Latin did not spread as widely in these countries that are shaded in white. So that's why this one in gold is off on his own to a degree. So, Roman Empire, spread of Latin, the creation of what we now call Romance languages. Your next question is, what is the name of the sea? So what is the name of the sea around which the Roman Empire grew? And there are clues here, linguistic language clues, to help you figure out the name. The first one is the word medius, which is a Latin word which means middle or medium. And then the second word is terra, which is also Latin and means land or terrain. So from those words, medius and terra, can you tell me what is the name of that sea around which the Roman Empire grew? And then once you've written down the name of the sea, I want you to create two word walls. Now by word walls I mean almost like a spider diagram. So you start in the middle with your word, and then around that word you try and think of as many other words that link to that as possible. So I want you to do two. The first one is for any words that link to med, and the second one I want you to do a word wall for any words that link to terra, T-E-R-R-A. So think about any words you can think of that have med at the beginning or in the middle. Think about any words that have terra in the beginning or in the middle, and try and write down as many as you can. I think the record for this is 16, I think, for one word wall in Year 7. So, see if you can beat the record of 16 words linking to one or other of those two words. So, this word vulgarity, the Romans coined this word, vulgarity, and they meant it to mean the mind of the herd being us, normal people. So your first question here is, what does the word vulgar mean? So again, you can write down your thoughts first. You could then do some research. You could ask somebody in your house, but try and come up with your own definition of the word vulgar. The Romance languages developed through the Latin that ordinary people used. So rather than those in power who built the empire, it was the people who were on the streets, people like you and I, who developed different languages through using Latin in different ways. The Latin word for ordinary people is vulgus. So we call the language from which the Romance languages grew Vulgar Latin. So on the right hand side, I've given you a picture. This is from a show called Nailed It, which is ridiculous but hilarious. And in it, the contestants get something like the picture on the left. So they'll get an object or a cake or something they've got to make that looks like the picture on the left. And then what happens, invariably, typically, is it ends up looking like the thing on the right. So the thing on the right would be what's called a vulgar version of the thing on the left. To do the thing on the left, you'd need to be a bit of an expert. So the thing on the right represents what most of us would be capable of doing. And this is what happened to Latin. Most people found the language quite difficult. So the people who spoke it tended to be not like your ordinary regular people on the street. It tended to be those in power who used it. Now this is important when it comes to looking at the development of language that we now speak today. So now we're going to have a look at educated Latin versus vulgar Latin. So here I've depicted this by way of horses. I'm not suggesting that little probably Falabella pony is vulgar at all, but I'm suggesting that educated Latin is grand and looks strong and a little bit intimidating, whereas vulgar Latin, much more accessible, much easier to catch metaphorically. Okay, so we're sticking with the theme of horses, and your next activity is to fill in the gaps with the word for horse in different languages. Now you can see on the left hand side this column language, and in that column you can see the different languages that we're looking at, and then on the right hand side there is the word for horse in that right hand column. So you can see that the Latin word for horse is equus. Equus, E-Q-U-U-S, equus. So that was spoken by the educated people, by the people in power. They would have used the word equus. Vulgar Latin, this is where we come to people like you and I. Ordinary people didn't use equus. After a little while they used caballus, C-A-B-A-L-L-U-S, caballus. So to get from equus to caballus is quite a move. There are a couple of sounds in there that are reflected, but this word is an indication of what happens when Latin mixes in with a language that is already in existence. So rather than adopting all the time the word, it was adapted to fit in with what the people knew. The Spanish, this is where we can see some of these Romance languages and how they link back to Vulgar Latin. So Spanish, the Spanish for horse is caballo. Caballo. So you could say caballo, but you wouldn't be pronouncing it correctly in Spanish. So it's C-A-B-A-L-L-O, and double L in Spanish is sometimes pronounced like a Y. So caballo, caballo. Your job is to find out the Italian name for a horse and then the French name for a horse. So these are the two words that you need to find, the Italian for horse and the French for horse. After you've done that, have a think about any words in English that we use today that have clearly descended from the word equus. So from the Latin term for a horse, what are some words in our language, in our English language, that have clearly descended from equus? And then have a think about if there are any words that have descended from the Vulgar Latin version of cabalus. And a tip for that would be to look at the French word, look at the French development of that, the French word for horse, and go from there. So centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire, the Romance-speaking Spaniards and Portuguese colonized huge areas of the world. As a result, millions of people outside Europe also speak Latinate languages, or Romance languages. Which countries in South America were colonized by the Spaniards and which were colonized by the Portuguese? Have a guess at that if you don't know. International football fans among you might have an advantage here. You might do. A clue is to have a look at the shape of South America and to think about the shape of Spain and Portugal, but flip it. And then you'll see who is responsible for the colonization of which countries. And then the question that I want you to answer on the form is, what do some people call South America? So what do some people call South America? And can you now identify why that is? This activity is a bit of fun, looking at some South American names, and I've given you the translation, and your job is to match up the translation of the place with its actual name. So on the left hand side, the translations we're looking for you to find, we've got rich coast, rich port, the saviour, silver, deep waters, and equator. And then on the right, you've got the places that you need to match up. So we've got Argentina, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and El Salvador. So your job is to match up the correct translation with the name of the place. Each one of those place names literally means one of those translations. Have a go and then write your answers up on the form. So this is really interesting and all very cool, but you might be asking, I thought this was about the development of language in England. What about us? Well, we're now going to have a look at just that. So Latin entered the English language, it entered our country and into the language that we speak by 4 different routes. So the first one was in AD 43 when the Romans invaded Britain. The second route was in AD 597 when St. Augustine came to Britain. The third time Latin entered our language was in AD 1066 when the Normans invaded Britain. Because which language did they bring? French. Correct. In AD 1500 to 1650, there was also a period called the Renaissance in Britain, and we will look at that in depth. But that was another period of time in which Latin became a dominant language once again in our country. So, just to gear us up, ready for Thursday's lesson about England and its development of language, I want you to answer the following questions. First question is, what were Roman roads famous for? Now, you don't have to write that one up because you should know it. But if you don't know it, as a clue, they're not famous for being anything like the road in the picture that I've used to illustrate this slide. So what were Roman roads famous for? The second question, this one I do want you to write up in the form. The Latin word for road is via. What is a viaduct? What is a viaduct? Next question, in what way is an aqueduct different from a viaduct? So, what is a viaduct and what is an aqueduct? Roman roads were usually paved. The Latin word for a laid surface is stratum. This entered our language as street. So there's some vulgarized Latin for you. Rather than stratum, we don't go for a walk up the stratum to get some eggs. We go up the street. We still use the word stratum though. And your next question is exactly that. What does that word stratum mean today? So when would we use the word stratum and what does it mean? And then the final question for today is a Roman mile was 1,000 Roman paces. So how does that lead us to the name mile? How does 1,000 Roman paces lead us to the name mile? So this is your final task for the day. I would like you to summarise your learning into a paragraph, and it needs to be a paragraph that you could read to someone else. I want you to be able to tell someone else about what you've learnt today. So write a summary of the new words you've learnt. Your paragraph should be written so that someone who wasn't in the lesson could learn from it too. So you might include things like key dates, you might include key countries, you might talk about how Latin became other things and why that was. And then it does say at the end you might choose to tell someone at home later. So writing this summary will help you remember. So summarise what you've learnt today in a paragraph. And we will see you on Thursday online for your second lesson in the timeline unit. And in that lesson we will look at the development of Old English.